Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Goff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 11 tight end and quarterback rankings for the 2025 fantasy football season, going over my top 16 rankings at both positions. So if you're looking for a specific player at the tight end or quarterback position, travel down to the description of the video as I have timestamps available there. While you're down in the description, if you have not yet already, of course, subscribe to the channel as I'm making daily fantasy football content in order to help you capture a fantasy football championship. Of course, uploading 5 days a week and live streaming 6 days a week. So if you have any questions, be sure to swing on by to the upcoming live streams later tonight after the Thursday Night Football game. I will be live here on the channel, so be sure to swing on by. I'm more than happy to help. Additionally, by subscribing today, not only do you gain an edge upon your league mates, you help me get one step closer to achieving my goal this season of 100,000 subscribers. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's go ahead and begin by talking about the tight end position in regards to receiving statistics allowed from weeks 5 through 10. Of course, the most recent 5 to 6 games for each individual defense is far more indicative as to what they're going to allow in the future games in comparison to what they allow to opposing tight ends in terms of receiving statistics in weeks 1 and 2. Therefore, we find that the Bengals, Jaguars, Colts, Vikings, Dolphins, Steelers are the most advantageous matchups going into the given week. And over the course of the last 5 to 6 weeks, if we've learned anything, it's to start our tight ends against the Jaguars and the Bengals. Therefore, we're going to fire up players like Gadsden, assuming he's healthy, against the Jaguars, or Freiermuth against the Bengals. But nonetheless, I just wanted to go ahead and represent some of the more advantageous matchups and also some of the more disadvantageous matchups going into the week, so that once I reference back to these, you guys know where these derived from as we go ahead and talk about the value of matchups going into week 11. With this all covered, before I get into talking about my top 16 tight ends, for those of you guys who want my rankings beyond my top 16 at the tight end position, and you want my all-encompassing rankings for tight end, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, kicker, defense, and flex for both half and full PPR scoring formats, travel down to the description of the video today and check out Betr. I'll be partnering with Betr for the entirety of the season to not only provide Sunday morning rankings, but of course provide plays every single day. Over the course of the last couple of days here, we've been on fire, putting together some solid plays on Monday and Wednesday. Now, in regards to tonight, of course, we have a couple plays that you could take advantage of, specifically Drake Maye, 1.5 passing touchdowns, going more on that. Travion Henderson going more than 68.5 rushing yards, and Jacoby Brissett going more than 9.5 points in the NBA. I don't trust any Jets. Maybe Breece Hall, but we'll talk about that at the end of today's episode when I put together my plays. But nonetheless, these are a couple plays that I really do like going into tonight's game. For those of you who are trying to take advantage of the opportunity of putting together some plays, getting a free $10 via Betr, and of course, being able to take advantage of the free pick of Drake Maye going into tonight. Of course, use code ANDED today. When you sign up, you get a free $10. And if you make a first-time deposit, minimum of $10, and make a first-time play within a real cash play, you'll be eligible to get my rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. So take advantage of the opportunity by checking out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your current location. And of course, expect those emails Sunday morning early. Be sure to check your spam folder. Thank you very much. Okay, let's begin to talk about the tight end position, beginning with Trey McBride, who has been unstoppable as of late. Over the course of the last 4 games with Jacoby Brissett under center, averaging 11.5 targets per game, 19.7 fantasy points per game, and a half PPR scoring format. So of course, we know he's an auto start. And with Marvin Harrison Jr. and Zay Jones not playing this week, of course, Zay Jones season-ending injury, Marvin Harrison Jr. unfortunately had to have a emergency surgery. Trey McBride is in line for potentially 15 plus targets, because amongst all tight ends thus far this season, he is number 2 in terms of yardage gained from the slot receiving role. While this season, the 49ers have given up the 3rd most receiving yards to opposing slot receiving options. Therefore, Trey McBride should dominate within the upcoming week in a matchup in which should be a negative game script, which means even more passing and, of course, target opportunity in the direction of Trey McBride. Number 2, we have Brock Bowers. We all anticipated after the Jaguars game going into the Broncos matchup on a Thursday night that there was going to be regression, but I did not expect the regression to turn into 1 reception for 31 yards. It's a lack of overall focus from the offense and of course the coordinator to get the ball in the direction of Brock Bowers. And I believe going forward, there's going to be a far greater emphasis in terms of incorporating Bowers within the offense in order to help them succeed, considering he is their number 1 offensive threat. Going up against the Cowboys this week, which is implicated in being one of the highest scoring games of the week, should bode well for both Geno Smith and Brock Bowers, as the Cowboys are allowing 12.16 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, the 12th best matchup. Recently, of course, we saw the tight ends of the Arizona Cardinals combined for 8 catches, 85 and a touchdown. Washington, 4 for 42 and a touchdown. The New York Jets, 96 yards and a touchdown. Many of tight ends finding success against the Cowboys. I mean, honestly, this Cowboys defense is playing, at an all-time worst. So we're anticipating a lot of success from this Raiders offense, and hopefully primarily from Brock Bowers. To close out the S tier, we have George Kittle. If in fact Purdy ends up playing this week, I think that only helps George Kittle, even though he is coming off of a game of 9 targets, 9 receptions, 84, and a diving touchdown. We were in a position this most recent week to where we were still a little bit concerned about George Kittle's overall utilization because of Mac Jones. Now, if in fact it ends up being Mac Jones once again, so be it. But everything that I'm reading and I am seeing is leading towards Brock Purdy ramping up to start this week against the Arizona Cardinals. We have to remember that with Brock Purdy, over the 37 games they have played together, George Kittle has scored 22 receiving touchdowns. That's a 60% rate. Incredible potential for this upcoming week, taking on the Arizona Cardinals, who have allowed a boatload of receptions to opposing tight ends as of late. Dallas's tight end, 6 catches for 64. Green Bay, 6 catches, 64 and a touchdown. Indianapolis, 7 for 79 and a touchdown. Tennessee, 8 for 82. There's a lot of potential this week in a matchup in which, of course, if Brock Purdy's coming back, he's going to lean upon his security blankets, number 1 being George Kittle. Moving on to our number 4, we have Oronde Gadsden, one of the halves of our thumbnail today, who practiced on Wednesday, which is a great sign coming off of a Sunday game against the Steelers, in which, of course, he had a little bit of a quad/knee injury. He was on a 4-game streak of 5 receptions and 68 yards minimum, and going into this week, the second best matchup at the position, the Jaguars, allowing over 20 fantasy points per game on average to opposing tight ends, recently giving up 7 catches, 53 and a touchdown to Houston's tight end, specifically Dalton Schultz. The Las Vegas tight ends went absolutely nuclear as a trio, 16 catches, 162 and 3 touchdowns. The LA Rams, 4 tight ends combined for 8 catches, 101 and a touchdown. Every tight end grouping has found success against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Therefore, Gadsden, if healthy, should be an auto start once again this week. Sam LaPorta is our number 5. Now, yesterday, he did end up missing practice due to a back injury, which is a little bit concerning, but we're hoping that later today, we're going to get an update that he, in fact, gets himself limited participation, if not full participation, going into this upcoming weekend's game against the Philadelphia Eagles. Because Sam LaPorta has been great as of late. We're talking about 4 of the last 5 games with 5 receptions and 53 yards minimum. As long as he continues to get that level of opportunity at a base minimum, on top of the receptions he finds within the red zone, having scored a receiving touchdown in 3 of the last 5 games, there's even more potential for upside, especially considering they are 2.5-point underdogs on the road, which does, in my mind, lead to a negative game script, a lot more passing from Jared Goff, who could find even more success this week considering how bad this Eagles defense has been in terms of stopping play action, which, of course, this most recent week, the Lions demonstrated their most play action rate amongst all games this season because of the play calling of Dan Campbell, which could lead to a lot of opportunity for Sam LaPorta down in the red zone while this defense is trying to, of course, cue in on David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. Number 6, we have Jake Ferguson. Look, the fact of the matter is Jake Ferguson with and without CeeDee Lamb is a little bit of a different overall monster. I mean, yes, in 2 of the last 3 games with CeeDee Lamb's return, he has had 7 targets. At a base minimum, that is great overall opportunity share, and hopefully it continues to stabilize in that direction, because going into this weekend's matchup against the Las Vegas Raiders, there's still an opportunity to find success. I mean, we have seen Kansas City tight ends 4 for 82, Tennessee 9 for 62 and a touchdown, Indianapolis 4 for 44 and a touchdown, all of this within the last couple games. Again, a lot of opportunity going in the direction of tight ends on teams that, again, heavily utilize their tight ends. But in the case of Jake Ferguson, he is very much so touchdown dependent. He needs the upside of a touchdown to save his fantasy week. A stat that I wanted to represent to you guys and that I've mentioned over the course of multiple weeks this season, specifically just looking at the last 4 weeks, the last month of the season, 39 of the top 48 tight ends who have ranked top 12 within their given weeks. So over the course of the last 4 weeks, the top 12 tight ends. 39 of the 48 that were in that top 12 position scored a touchdown within their scoreline. That's an 81% rate. Again, if you want to be a top 12 tight end, you got to score a touchdown. And luckily, Jake Ferguson is number 5 amongst all players in the league thus far in terms of red zone targets and number 6 in terms of receiving touchdowns. All right, let's move on to the next tight end I wanted to mention to close out this tier. It's Travis Kelce. He's number 2 amongst all tight ends in terms of yards per route run when his quarterback is being pressured. Therefore, anytime Patrick Mahomes is under pressure, expect for him to look in the direction of his security blanket, Travis Kelce. And the reason why this is so important is because, of course, the Broncos generate the second most pressure on quarterback dropbacks thus far this season. So going into this week, coming off of the bye, of course, we know that Andy Reid is 22-4 coming off of the bye in his career. There is going to be a lot of potential in which of course this Kansas City Chiefs offense is able to deliver. But since the return of Rashee Rice, Travis Kelce's overall opportunity shares have dipped. He's only getting about 5.3 targets per game on average, but still averaging 12.13 fantasy points per game on average, and taking on the Broncos this week, allowing over 11 fantasy points per game over the course of the last 6 games. The anticipation is, of course, Travis Kelce should be fantasy relevant, hopefully once again, considering how much success this offense has found outside of their singular kryptonite game against the Buffalo Bills. Number 8, we have Theo Johnson. Look, since week 4, he is the number 5 overall tight end and number 8 in terms of fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR. He is ranked as a top 13 weekly tight end in 5 of the last 7 games. And now with Jameis Winston starting, the opportunity for upside increases that much more, even without Jackson Dart under center. Because from what we saw with Jameis Winston and the Cleveland Browns last year, he elevated every single offensive piece in his time as a starter. From weeks 8 through 14 with David Njoku was averaging 12.23 fantasy points per game. I'm hoping that level of potential upside increases for Theo Johnson to continue to keep him as a fantasy relevant piece for another consecutive game until the return of Jackson Dart. Number 9, we have Dalton Schultz. Look, post bye week, he's been getting 10, 3, 8, and 11 targets. And in the games in which he has gotten 8 or more targets, he's producing over 10 plus fantasy points in a half PPR every single time out. He's 5th amongst all tight ends thus far this season in terms of inline receiving yards, and he's taken on a matchup which is the 7th best in terms of receiving yards from the inline allowed to opposing tight ends. Again, this Titans defense allowing 10.94 fantasy points per game on average, recently giving up their fair share of statistics in terms of 6 catches, 80 yards to the Chargers, 6 for 44 and a touchdown to New England, 6 for 54 and a touchdown to the Raiders. Again, many of Titans finding success and considering the utilization of Schultz as of late with Stroud or with Davis Mills should once again be relevant regardless of who plays quarterback this week for the Houston Texans. Moving on to our number 10, we have Mark Andrews. Look, the fact of the matter is in the last 2 games with Lamar Jackson, he has 8 targets, 5 receptions, and 3 receiving touchdowns. He has more receptions of touchdowns than just regular receptions as of the last 2 weeks. And like I mentioned earlier with Jake Ferguson, when we talk about the tight end position, it's all about touchdowns in a half PPR. 39 of the last 48 tight ends who have ranked in the top 12 over the course of the last 4 weeks, very simple, the last 4 groupings of top 12 tight ends, 39 of the 48, that's an 81% success rate, have accompanied their performance with 1 singular touchdown. Taking on the Browns this week isn't the easiest overall matchup, but they've given up their fair share of points in a touchdown to the New England, Pittsburgh, and Minnesota tight ends as of late. Therefore, we should anticipate Mark Andrews to continue his streak of success, especially considering back in week 2 against Cleveland, dropped a touchdown clear as day if you guys remember that. Moving on to our number 11 to close out this tier, we have Dallas Goedert. He is number 3 amongst all tight ends in terms of red zone receiving touchdowns. Like I mentioned just moments ago with Mark Andrews and Jake Ferguson, in the last 4 weeks, the top 12 ranked tight ends in those weeks, 39 of the 48 accompanied their performance with a touchdown. It's an 81% rate. Again, if you want to find yourself having a top 12 ranked tight end, they've got to be touchdown relevant. Otherwise, the yardage and receptions they have to gain is an astronomical number, which very few tight ends can often find themselves kind of succeeding within that range. Nonetheless, taking on Detroit, who has given up 6 catches, 64 and a touchdown to Washington tight ends, scored a touchdown from the Minnesota Vikings tight ends, 7 catches for 65 from Cade Otton, 8 catches, 103 from the Kansas City tight ends. This Detroit Lions secondary has struggled against tight ends considering all the injuries to their safeties. Expect for Dallas Goedert to have himself a successful week here. Number 12, we have Cade Otton. So he's in a little bit of a tricky situation considering there's a possibility in which, in fact, Chris Godwin and Bucky Irving are returning. If, in fact, that is the case, there may be less opportunity in the direction of Cade Otton, but we're not 100% certain whether or not these two are going to be active this week. Time will tell as we get closer to Sunday. But in the absence of Godwin and Evans over the course of the last 3 games, he has seen 9, 5, and 12 targets, which has led to 10, 6, and 12.5 half PPR fantasy points. In the event in which, of course, Godwin and Bucky are out, even against the toughest matchup at the tight end position, the Buffalo Bills, I'd still be willing to roll with Cade Otton in a negative game script in a game in which I would anticipate him to still be very much so target relevant within the matchup. Number 13, we have Pat Freiermuth. The Bengals, again, are allowing nearly 25 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Last time out against this defense, had 5 catches for 111 and 2 receiving touchdowns for 25.6 fantasy points. The Bengals have allowed 10 plus fantasy points to 7 tight ends in the last 7 weeks. Expect for Pat Freiermuth, Darnell Washington, Jonnu Smith to all be fantasy relevant in this matchup at home against the Cincinnati Bengals defense that cannot stop opposing tight ends. Moving on to our number 14, we have Kyle Pitts. Look, this most recent week, he had a top-tier matchup, and he got less targets than all the other games in which he had far more difficult matchups. It's kind of ridiculous that occurred, but I'm not willing to give up on Kyle Pitts just yet. Taking on the 9th best matchup at the position this week, the Carolina Panthers, who are allowing nearly 13 fantasy points per game on average, and just most recently gave up 7 catches, 122 yards and a touchdown to New Orleans Saints tight ends. I would hope to see Kyle Pitts get himself a far greater opportunity share this upcoming week, and hopefully exact some revenge after losing 30-0 last time out against the Carolina Panthers defense. Number 15 is Zach Ertz, taking on, of course, a Miami defense that is the 5th best matchup at the position. Recently, Buffalo 6 catches, 100 and a touchdown. Baltimore 7 for 105 and 3 touchdowns. Atlanta 9 for 59. Los Angeles 9 for 86. This is as good of a matchup as you could possibly ask for, with McLaurin already being designated out for Sunday's game in Madrid, and Deebo Samuel not seeing himself a boatload of opportunity. This opened up another week in which, of course, Zach Ertz could be the leading receiving option for this offense. My number 16 to close out today's tight end conversation is Colston Loveland. His snaps returned to normal with Komet's return, but he still saw himself far more utilization than he has earlier this year. As long as they continue to drift in his direction, he's taken on the 4th easiest matchup at the tight end position, the Vikings, who are allowing 15.84 fantasy points per game on average and have been torched by Baltimore, Detroit, the Chargers, and Cleveland Browns just as of late. So expect for, of course, Colston Loveland to find himself a semblance of success and hopefully some red zone utilization in order to elevate him into that top 12 conversation by week's end. All right, that's going to cover it in regards to our tight ends. Let's move on to talking about some quarterbacks based on passing statistics allowed from weeks 5 through 10. Like I've mentioned before, the most recent 5-6 games being far more indicative of what these defenses can produce and allow to opposing quarterbacks. Therefore, we are firing up quarterbacks like Justin Herbert on a weekly basis, but have even more credence to do so because of the matchup against the Jaguars. Quarterbacks taking on the 49ers, Commanders, Bengals, Cowboys, Vikings are all in an incredibly advantageous position, as all of those defenses are allowing over 18 fantasy points per game just off of passing statistics isolated in a 4-point per passing touchdown league, minus 2 points per interception. This does not even include the potential for rushing upside that all of these quarterbacks may have going into the upcoming week. Just wanted to go ahead and represent some of the more advantageous while also representing some of the more disadvantageous matchups, as I will reference back to these statistics going into the conversation of these quarterbacks. So let's go ahead and begin by talking about my top 16 quarterback rankings with, of course, our number 1, Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. There are not very many quarterbacks like Josh Allen, considering he's coming off a week in which he scored 20 fantasy points while turning over the ball twice and losing 30-13 to the Miami Dolphins on the road. Again, as of late, on the road, they haven't been a great team. At home, of course, they've only lost 1 game in the last couple years. So the fact of the matter is, taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week, it's no surprise that they're 5.5-point favorites. And to give you even further understanding just how good Josh Allen is at home in comparison to on the road over the course of this season, at home, 268 passing yards per game in comparison to on the road, 199. In terms of touchdowns per game, on the ground or through the air, 2.5 per game. At home, 1.75 on the road. There's that much more potential for upside for someone like Josh Allen, as long as he's at home, which this week he is, taking on a defense in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers who just got torched by the New England Patriots this most recent week. Moving on to our number 2, we have Lamar Jackson. On Wednesday, he missed practice with a knee injury. It is expected that later today he should practice, and hopefully he'll get himself full practice designations over the course of the next 2 days so that we don't have to worry going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Cleveland Browns. A defense that back in week 2 allowed 4 passing touchdowns from Lamar Jackson, primarily because of the running game of Derrick Henry, was completely nullified. This Cleveland Browns team, again, even though they have shown great run-stopping efforts earlier this year, I would anticipate, of course, Derrick Henry to find far more success, which should lead to less potential upside for Lamar Jackson this week. But he should be able to find himself his 2 to 3 touchdowns this week, considering you're facing against Dylan Gabriel and your 7.5-point favorites on the road. Of course, as we know, Lamar is an auto start. Justin Herbert, to close out the S tier, closes out with the conversation of taking on the number 1 matchup at the quarterback position, a defense allowing over 20.97 fantasy points per game through the air. Davis Mills went for 292 passing yards, 2 touchdowns through the air, and 1 rushing touchdown. Geno Smith had 4 passing touchdowns. Matthew Stafford had 5 passing touchdowns against this defense. They cannot stop a soul. So we should all be expecting a bounce back, not only in the touchdown category, of course, getting his 2+ touchdowns, but also within the rushing category, as the secondary is scrambling to try to cover the majority of the field, taking on the slew of receivers that, of course, the Los Angeles Chargers will continue to utilize against that secondary. Expect for some scramble yards, 2, maybe even 3 passing touchdowns for Justin Herbert this week. Number 4, speaking of scrambling yards, we have Drake Maye, who hopefully is going to find himself scrambling tonight. and hopefully is going to get as many fantasy points as we can generate. Even though Thursday night games have been pretty gross as of late, I'm hoping that it's not going to affect Drake Maye. And I'm hoping he's just going to completely annihilate the Jets. I don't care about watching a boring game as long as my Drake Maye puts up his fantasy points that is required. Over the course of this season, specifically the last 9 games, 8 of those games consisting of 2 or more touchdowns from Drake Maye. He has been highly efficient as of late, and when you're taking on the Jets defense that is missing their best players, and you're 12.5 point favorites at home going into tonight's game, this should be a cakewalk taking on the 10th easiest matchup at the position, who just allowed 2 passing touchdowns from Dillon Gabriel against them. The expectation is that, of course, Drake Maye, taking on the Jets defense that has generated the 3rd lowest pressure rate against opposing quarterbacks, and considering Drake Maye has the 7th highest adjusted passing completion percentage while in a clean pocket and the 4th most passing touchdowns while in a clean pocket this season, the expectation is that he should be able to put together another huge performance here tonight. Dak Prescott is our number 5. The implication is that this should be the highest scoring game of the week, primarily because the Dallas Cowboys defense is as bad as it gets. Maybe they're not as bad as the Cincinnati Bengals, but they're pretty damn bad. And because of that, that has forced Dak Prescott for a majority of the season to have to air it out. He had a 4-game streak of 3 passing touchdowns or more prior to taking on the Denver Broncos and the Arizona Cardinals. And even though he wasn't the most efficient in his 2 most recent games, he's coming off of the bye, and he is the 2nd most efficient quarterback against zone coverage thus far this season. And over the course of this year, this Pete Carroll defense has ran the 4th most zone coverage. Therefore, expect for Dak Prescott with CeeDee Lamb, George Pickens, and Jake Ferguson to absolutely dominate against the secondary. Number 6 is Matthew Stafford. Speaking of dominating against secondaries, 5 of the last 6 games, 3 or more passing touchdowns. He is going for all the records this season. And taking on the Seattle Seahawks this week, even though, yes, they have a solid defense and a great pass rush, they are running the 2nd most zone coverage amongst all teams. And Matthew Stafford is the number 1 quarterback against zone this year in terms of overall efficiency, effectiveness, and he is absolutely going to impose his will with Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams, and of course the 17 tight ends that they utilize within their formations. This defense is allowing the 13 most points to opposing quarterbacks thus far this season, primarily because of their elite run-stopping nature. Considering they've allowed 2+ passing touchdowns to 4 of the last 6 quarterbacks they have taken on, expect for Matthew Stafford to reach his 3, if not 4 touchdowns this week. Number 7, we have Patrick Mahomes. Pre-bye week, they took on their kryptonite matchup with the Buffalo Bills during the regular season. But prior to that game, he had 3+ touchdowns in 4 of the previous 5 games up until that, Bills matchup. The fact of the matter is, taking on the Broncos isn't going to be that difficult of a matchup in my opinion because of the struggle of the Broncos offense as of late, which in my mind is only going to present even more opportunities available to Patrick Mahomes and this offense to find success. And considering Pacheco's injury, potentially a lack of a running game, it will lead to even more rushing upside for Patrick Mahomes, where he continues to unlock his overall of upside within that category. Andy Reid is 22-4 coming off of the bye week. Expect for a victory and of course a huge performance here from Patrick Mahomes. Number 8 to begin the B tier is Jalen Hurts. Look, he's coming off of an underwhelming week, but prior to this most recent week, 6 of his last 7 games, 2 or more touchdowns scored. So he's going to have a bounce back, taking on a defense that, again, is hopefully going to continue to allow a lot of points to opposing wide receivers, top 6 within that category. And even though this defense has been stout against the run, that's perfectly fine. They can stop Saquon Barkley, which will force Jalen Hurts to guide it through the air. And of course, the tush push will hopefully land him in the end zone. This is a defense that has played the 2nd most man coverage in the NFL this season. And Jalen Hurts is ranked 3rd in terms of EPA per play against man coverage. Hopefully, we'll see a lot more utilization of A.J. Brown within the matchup. Number 9, we have Joe Flacco. Look, for 3 consecutive games, he has had 3 touchdowns minimum. So why wouldn't you automatically start him, taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers, who are the 7th best matchup at the position? And just a couple weeks ago, on a short week Thursday night game, Joe Flacco went for 342 yards and 3 passing touchdowns against them. I don't see a reason why I wouldn't start Joe Flacco. Yes, he didn't practice on Wednesday, but they are making sure that his shoulder is at 100% healthy rate going into this coming weekend's game. Of course, had a bye week in order to get fully healthy and should be able to absolutely torch the secondary like he did just a couple weeks back. Number 10, we have Mac Jones. Look, the fact of the matter is, whether or not it is Mac Jones or Brock Purdy, I am starting a 49ers quarterback this week, primarily because of the advantageous nature of this matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, who had both of their starting corners, Max Melton and Will Johnson, missing in this most recent game. And considering Mac Jones has had 3 consecutive games of 2+ passing touchdowns and Brock Purdy may not be at a full 100% healthy rate, it may justify Kyle Shanahan rolling Mac Jones for another consecutive game, coming off a week of 3 passing touchdowns, 319 passing yards, and an 85% passing completion percentage. It justifies playing him under the assumption that, of course, Purdy's out, and we have Will Johnson and Max Melton missing another consecutive week to elevate the quarterback play on the opposite side of the field. Then we have our number 11, Caleb Williams. Look, this most recent week was saved by his rushing upside of 63 yards and a rushing touchdown. Of course, this week won't have to deal with all the weather that is implicated, like in this most recent game, which was heavy rain downpour. And they are taking on the Minnesota Vikings indoors. And then we know that the Minnesota Vikings, over the course of this entire season and over the course of the last couple of years, are a blitz-heavy team. Caleb Williams has not fared well against a lot of pressure this season. So hopefully they will lean upon the running game, and then it'll potentially lead to even more scrambling. If, in fact, we're going to be in a position in which, of course, Caleb Williams is going to have to play from behind, which is looking like it's probably going to be the case. I mean, the Vikings are the 6th easiest matchup at the quarterback position for a reason. They have allowed 4 games of 2 passing touchdowns or more as of late, prior to this most recent game of Lamar Jackson struggling. Therefore, expect for Caleb Williams to find himself in abundance of success this week. Baker Mayfield is our number 12, taking on Buffalo. With Chris Godwin and Bucky Irving potentially returning or trending towards a return, it potentially elevates this offense even more. That's like Thor returning back to Wakanda to potentially save the Avengers. That's the kind of level of what Bucky Irving and Godwin can provide to the upcoming matchup against Buffalo, who have an inability to stop the run. So if Bucky Irving is added to the overall equation, we're going to have ourselves an opportunity for Baker Mayfield and this offense to be able to not only move the ball that much more effectively, but lead to more potential touchdowns, considering to begin the season, Bucky Irving for the first 4 games of the year didn't have a single rushing touchdown. Again, it'll lead them down the field, get them into the red zone, which of course Baker Mayfield will cap it off with passing touchdowns. Number 13 is Jared Goff. This season thus far, he is number 4 amongst all quarterbacks in terms of play action passing yards. And in this most recent game with Dan Campbell taking over the play calling duties, they ran their highest play action rate amongst all games this season. So if you're taking on the Eagles, who have allowed the 2nd most yards per play versus play action, anticipate for Jared Goff to really deliver a great performance against this defense on Sunday Night Football, in which the weather should be implicated for clear skies and maybe just a little bit of wind, nothing of a big deal. With the Eagles being favorited, I truly do believe this means a lot of potential for upside in terms of the passing category of Jared Goff, and hopefully a shootout going into the matchup. Number 14 is Sam Darnold. Look, the fact of the matter is this most recent week is not very much so what Sam Darnold typically produces. They were up 35-0 with 8 minutes remaining in the second quarter, and he has had himself just as many passing touchdowns as passing incompletions in the last 2 games. So expect for Sam Darnold, who has put up 20 or more fantasy points in 3 of the last 5 games, to get back to potentially putting up that range of points, as that is the expectation against the Rams secondary, who did give him a lot of struggles last season in the 2 matchups in which the Minnesota Vikings took on the Rams, whether it was regular season or postseason. So if in fact the pass rush can get to Sam Darnold and they can disrupt his overall play, that could be the biggest difference maker. We'll have to wait and see. Jacoby Brissett is our number 15. I understand that losing Marvin Harrison Jr. and Zay Jones is going to make an impact, but the fact of the matter is that San Francisco 49ers defense is the 2nd easiest matchup at the position. They have allowed everyone to score against them. 5 of the last 6 games, 2 passing touchdowns minimum, 2 opposing quarterbacks. Since week 6, Jacoby Brissett has taken over, and he is the number 9 overall quarterback in fantasy since then. I am still firing him up in the anticipation of garbage time points being racked up over the course of this game. Number 16 is Jameis Winston. His MO over the course of his career has been to be fantasy relevant, regardless of whether or not he is the starter or whether he's a backup. If he steps up into the overall equation, he typically delivers, and he did exactly that with the Cleveland Browns and the lacking offense they had. Of course, we have seen Jackson Dart for the last couple weeks here be incredibly relevant on the ground through the air. I think Jameis Winston, even though this is a difficult matchup, I'm willing to take the risk. You could go ahead and avoid the risk, play J.J. McCarthy, play Jordan Love, play Aaron Rodgers. But for some reason, I'm feeling like Jameis Winston this upcoming week has himself a lot of potential for success, considering what he has done over the course of his career. Being a gunslinger, no matter how many times he turns over the ball, the garbage time of 300 yards and 3 touchdowns is always within reach for Jameis Winston. All right, before we close out today's episode, I wanted to go ahead and, of course, mention a couple of the plays that I'm making via Betr going into tonight's game. Like I've mentioned before, and I went ahead and represented it, and I'll go ahead and blow it up on screen. This is the play that I'm making going into tonight. To begin, we have Jakob Poeltl taking on the Cleveland Browns today. Of course, going more than 9.5 fantasy points, has done that in back-to-back games. Then we have Drake Maye going for more than 1.5 passing touchdowns, accomplished that in 8 of the last 9. Then we have Travion Henderson on the special play of 68.5 rushing yards, going more on that number, considering, of course, the Jets have allowed 72, 167, 110, 142, and 109 rushing yards to opposing running backs over the course of the last 6 games. Expect for a lot of upside, especially with Ramondre Stevenson being out this week on a short Thursday night game. I would anticipate for, of course, Travion Henderson to be given opportunities. And shoot, he can make this singular yardage gain on one single run, considering he had 2 runs of over 55 yards in this most recent game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That's going to cover for me today. Of course, be sure to use code Andrew via Betr. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll be back later tonight live streaming here on the channel. If you have any questions, be sure to swing on by. And until next time, thank you, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.